So these are two of the top contenders when it comes to a budget-friendly running and fitness watch, the COROS Pace 3 and the Garmin Forerunner 165, where both these watches pack in quite a few features for the money, like plenty of health features, running features, training feedback, as well as the ability to track plenty of other sports as well, including open water swimming. And while both of these are great values and also share a lot of the same features, there are some differences between them which may make you want to choose one over the other, and that's my aim in this video, is to explain some of those differences to help you decide which one's going to be right for you. And if you do happen to find the information in this video useful, do me a quick favor and just quickly hit that like button down below. It's a small thing that you can do that'll help this video and the channel out quite a bit, and I appreciate it. Okay, so let's go ahead and first start out with price. So the COROS Pace 3 starts out at $229 and the Garmin Forerunner 165 starts out at $249. So 20 bucks more for the 165. But I also do want to mention that the 165 has an option with music capabilities with music streaming services for $299. When it comes to size and weight, so that's actually going to be a pretty big highlight for both of these, where they're nice lightweight watches. So these are going to be awesome for running as well as plenty of other sports where they're just incredibly comfortable, and they're also going to be great for daily wear, including being able to wear them for sleep. The construction on these is going to be pretty similar here as well, where both of them have resin cases. And then for the lens to protect the display, the Pace 3 has a mineral glass lens and the 165 has a chemically strengthened glass lens, but you can go ahead and install screen protectors on either of these for some additional scratch resistance. And then both also do have a 5 ATM water resistance rating, so they're going to be perfectly fine in the shower as well for swimming. So for the displays, both of these have 1.2-inch touchscreen displays, but here's one of the big differences between the two. So the Pace 3 uses a memory and pixel or transflective display versus the 165, which uses an AMOLED display. So memory and pixel displays like the one that's found on the Pace 3 have some advantages when it comes to readability and direct sunlight, where these kind of displays actually get better the brighter it is outside. The other advantage with these kinds of displays is that they need less power than AMOLED displays. The downside of these kinds of displays, though, is that it's kind of harder to see them indoors without a backlight on, and they're not as crisp and vibrant as an AMOLED display. AMOLED displays, on the other hand, like the one that's found on the 165, so these are going to be super bright. They have lots of vibrant colors as well as a lot of contrast. They have a higher pixel count as well, so there's going to be more resolution. It's basically just going to be like your smartphone. The downside to these kinds of displays, though, is that they consume more power than a memory and pixel display, and I guess that's a great segue into battery life. Now, when it comes to battery life, so this can vary quite a bit depending on how the watch is set up, like what kind of settings that you use, as well as how many outdoor activities that you track. So if you're just going to be using them like straight up just as a smartwatch, you can get up to 11 days on the 165 if you're not using the always-on display, where you just kind of turn your wrist to wake up the display, and then around 4 to 5 days if you're using the always-on display, where it just basically kind of dims to a lower brightness setting when you're not interacting with it. On the Pace 3, well, this kind of display is always on all the time, and then you can get up to 17 days out of it. However, to do the most apples-to-apples comparison of battery life, there's a couple settings that we have to make sure to turn on the Pace 3. So that's going to be stress tracking as well as enabling real-time heart rate tracking versus every 10 minutes, which are on by default on the 165. And that brings the Pace 3 down to about 9 days or so for my testing. Still very good though, but I think it's kind of good to mention those settings because it does make it a closer comparison. And then when it comes to battery life for tracking outdoor activities, so there's two different scenarios I actually wanted to show you here, since there is a difference between the satellite chipsets between the two. So the Pace 3 has a dual frequency satellite chipset versus the 165, which has a single band chipset. Now, I'll go ahead and mention this right now, that just because the Pace 3 does have a dual frequency satellite chipset doesn't automatically make it more accurate than the 165 with only a single band chipset. In fact, you will definitely want to check out the GPS accuracy section later on for those details. So the most direct comparison is going to be using the All Systems GNSS single band mode, which both of these have, and they advertise that you can get up to 17 hours on the 165 versus 25 hours on the Pace 3. And for how that fares in the real world, actually both these watches far exceeded the advertised battery life claim, so that was pretty cool to see out of both of them. But if you're using the dual frequency mode on the Pace 3, so that's going to drop it down to an advertised up to 15 hours of battery life, and that's where it's actually going to be pretty similar in terms of battery life compared to the 165. So if you're using these watches with their highest accuracy settings, it's actually going to be pretty similar, but you can get more out of the Pace 3 if you drop it down to that all systems mode. Again, the question is, does that dual band mode on the Pace 3 actually make a difference? More details on that in a bit. So to actually get around these watches in terms of how you actually interface with them, so both of them have touchscreens and then both of them also have physical buttons. So the 165 uses a 5-button configuration where the Pace 3 has 2 buttons, with one of those buttons also being a digital dial that you can use for scrolling. But when it comes to the number of buttons and how they work, so it kind of may come down to personal preference where some may prefer a more simple arrangement with the Pace 3 with just 2 buttons and then you just scroll with the dial, or on the other hand, someone else may prefer a 5-button configuration on the 165. I'm personally not really a huge fan of dials for scrolling, and that's really on any watch, by the way, not just the COROS, but again, that's just kind of my personal preference. Now, when it comes to smartwatch features, so both of these are compatible with both iPhones as well as Android phones, but the functionality is going to be a little bit different here as well, depending on which phone that you use. So if you have an iPhone, you'll be able to receive one-way notifications for texts, calls, and apps from either of these. But when you have them paired with an Android phone, so the 165 here has an additional capability of being able to reply to text and calls with predefined responses. So you'll be able to send quick replies with the 165 where the Pace 3 doesn't have this capability. And then when it comes to music, again, this is kind of interesting here. So the Pace 3 does actually have offline music playback capabilities, but these are just going to be with MP3 files that you'll transfer over from your computer. Now, the base model of the 165 doesn't have any music capabilities, but there is that 165 music option that runs $50 more, where it has offline music playback capabilities with streaming services like Spotify and Amazon Music. Of course, that does add a bit on top of the price tag, which makes it a little bit of a harder comparison, but those are just some of the things to consider if you're planning on wanting to listen to music while you're out on your run without needing to bring your phone with you. And then both also do have the same storage capability with 4 GB of storage. Oh, and then one last thing on the smartwatch end of things is that the 165 also does have contactless payments with Garmin Pay. So this could come in handy if you're out on a run or a ride and you didn't have your phone or your credit card with you and you wanted to get a snack or something. And snacks, of course, are obviously very important. Okay, so now let's go ahead and get into health features. So both of these can track your heart rate 24 hours a day, and both of these also have an SpO2 sensor, but again, there's actually a couple small differences here in how they work. So like I was mentioning earlier, out of the box, COROS watches actually measure heart rate in every 10-minute intervals throughout the day when you're not doing an activity, but you can enable real-time heart rate recording, which uses a bit more battery life. Garmin watches, on the other hand, are set to measure all the time. It's just on or off with the Garmin device. Another difference, though, comes down to the SpO2 sensor for measuring blood oxygen saturation levels. So the SpO2 sensor on the 165 is going to be utilized during sleep, but you can also set it to be on all the time if you'd like, or you can just set it to be off and just take manual measurements. The SpO2 sensor on the Pace 3, though, isn't currently used during sleep tracking or daily tracking for that matter. Rather, it's meant to be used more in high altitude situations where you may want to monitor your blood oxygen saturation levels more closely with their altitude alert feature, but you also can take manual readings with their wellness check feature. I did ask COROS about why their SpO2 sensor isn't utilized for sleep tracking, and they didn't necessarily have an answer at this point, but they definitely heard my feedback, so there may be a change with that in the future. And then both the Pace 3 and the 165 also do have daily stress tracking, and then in addition to all that, there's also kind of an on-demand feature that you can use to collect many health metrics at one time, including your heart rate, blood oxygen saturation levels, stress level, as well as HRV, with the health snapshot feature on the 165 and then the wellness check feature on the Pace 3. And then both of these also do have sleep tracking, and I find both of these to do just fine when it comes to tracking the time I went to bed, as well as the time I woke up, as well as any periods throughout the night when I was awake. I don't actually usually dive into these sleep stages much though, just because even with equipment that's used in labs, that's apparently only like 80% accurate or so. But I guess what I'd say is that I haven't necessarily seen anything wild in either of these either. The 165, however, does give you a sleep score based on what it tracked, and I generally find this to be a pretty good representation of the quality of my sleep. And then two other things that the 165 can do in the sleep department is that it also can track naps, and then it also does have their sleep coach feature, which provides a recommendation for the amount of sleep that would be ideal for your next night's sleep, based on factors like your last night's sleep, sleep history, workout history, and then some other factors. And that leads us into another feature that the 165 has called body battery. So body battery is the Garmin specific feature that gives you an estimation of your current energy levels based on your sleep, any restful periods throughout the day, any workouts, as well as any stress. It's kind of an interesting metric, and I do find that it actually lines up with how I actually feel at a given moment. It could be a useful feature for some, but maybe not for everyone out there either. The 165 also comes with Garmin's morning report feature. So what this does is that when you wake up, it displays important details that you'd likely want to know each morning, like how you slept, your HRV, your recovery time, as well as your body battery. And then on the activity tracking side of things, so both of these will track your calories, both will track your steps, as well as your floors climbed, since both of these do also have an altimeter. Now, when it comes to sport profiles and what kind of sports these watches can track, so both of these have all the most common activity profiles that you could expect, like running both indoors and outdoors, cycling both indoors and outdoors as well. There's gym-based profiles, including strength training, where both can attempt to count your reps, and then both also do have pool swimming as well as open water swimming. Where they differ, though, comes down to some of the other profiles. So the main difference is really going to be that the Pace 3 has triathlon and multi-sport support. Now, even though the 165 has running, cycling, as well as swimming profiles, it doesn't have a triathlon mode, which means that it's not possible to track your entire multi-sport event without manually starting, stopping, and then choosing another sport profile, where the Pace 3 has that feature, where you can basically seamlessly transition from one profile to another during your event, plus the additional capability of tracking transitions. Additionally, the Pace 3 also does have more outdoor recreation profiles like skiing and snowboarding, but on the flip side, the 165 has more gym-based profiles as well as profiles like tennis. So both of these can track a lot of different kinds of activities, but if you're interested in triathlon specifically, the Pace 3 is going to be your better bet, as well as if you want some more of those outdoor recreation profiles. But if you tend to spend a little bit more time in the gym, the 165 may be the better bet with more profiles in that department. Now, when it comes to the kinds of data that you can collect for workouts, so with any kind of workouts, you'll get your heart rate, calories burned, as well as your training effect, as in how much you're impacting your aerobic or anaerobic fitness level. In addition to that, though, the Pace 3 also calculates your training load. So this directly correlates to the time that you spend in different heart rate zones, and this can be a tool that can help you understand the impact on your body from a workout. And then taking that data, the Pace 3 will also give you your training load for the current week, as well as your 4-week intensity distribution of the time that you spend at different intensities. Now, one thing that's kind of weird about the training load widget on the Pace 3, though, is that it shows your training load for the current week, not the last 7 days, which is what I kind of prefer, as well as a lot of other athletes out there. One more thing that the Pace 3 has is what they call an intensity trend. So this compares your recent training load over the last 7 days and how that compares to the last 6 weeks or so of training. So in this example, my load impact on the right represents my average daily training load I've had over the last 7 days. And then on the left is my base fitness, which shows my average daily training load over the last 6 weeks. And based on that comparison, it says that I'm basically optimized, meaning that my training load over the last week is productive in the sense that I'm putting in more work than usual, but not too much where I may be overtraining. And how you can use this intensity trend metric is to make sure that your training is going to be staying consistent, to track rises in training load as in you're trying to increase your volume, but also for tapering where you may want to decrease training load maybe leading up to a race. And then on the running side of things specifically, so with both of them, you get all the usual stuff like distance, pace, cadence, as well as stride length. And then they also will both collect running power from the wrist itself without the need for an external accessory. Additionally, though, the 165 can also collect advanced running dynamics like vertical ratio, vertical oscillation, as well as ground contact time, again, directly from the wrist without the need for an accessory. But with the Pace 3, you'll actually need their running pod to collect this data. And that actually leads into what kinds of external sensors that these watches can support. So both these can pair to external heart rate sensors as well as speed and cadence sensors for cycling. Beyond that, though, the differences are kind of interesting here, where with the Pace 3, you can also pair it with cycling power meters as well as smart bike trainers, where you can't do that with the 165. However, with the 165, you can pair it up with Garmin's Vardia radar and lights, as well as some of Garmin's other sensors like their temperature sensor. And then one more difference here is that the 165 can pair to both ANT+ as well as Bluetooth sensors, where the Pace 3 only pairs to Bluetooth sensors. Now, if you do use the Pace 3 with COROS' running pod accessory, you can then get some of those more advanced running dynamics like the 165 can collect just from the wrist, like ground contact time and stride ratio. But in addition to that, you can also take their running fitness test or running form test with the Pod 2, which essentially gives you a score on your running form, like how well you're balancing your left and right balance, your stride ratio, and other metrics, which could be useful information to help you improve your form. And then both can also estimate your VO2 max for running, and then both also have a race predictor for times that you could potentially achieve for common running race distances. However, I find that the VO2 max as well as the race times are closer to reality on the 165 than the Pace 3. The Pace 3 also has a useful metric called effort pace, which for all intents and purposes is what everyone else calls grade adjusted pace. And grade adjusted pace is basically a way of taking into account hills and elevation changes during your run to give you an equivalent pace that you would be potentially running on flat ground. And the reason that this can be useful is that if you're doing a run with a lot of hilly terrain, your actual pace will likely be slower than you'd be doing on flat ground. So grade adjusted pace takes into account the hilly terrain to give you a flat ground equivalent. The 165 unfortunately doesn't provide this metric, unlike Garmin's higher end watches, so that could be a useful feature if you run a lot on hilly terrain, especially like trail running. Now, two kind of random but somewhat interesting features that the Pace 3 has that aren't found in the 165 are a camera control feature where you can control your GoPro or Insta360 camera from your watch when they're connected. And then the Pace 3 also has COROS' new screen mirroring feature that you can use to display the information that you're collecting on your watch on your phone. And then on the training and workout side of things, so both of these do have training plans that you can download to your watch, as well as structured workouts so you can follow along. And then both also do have a pacing feature for running with COROS' virtual pacer feature, as well as the Pace Pro feature on the 165. But the virtual pacer feature on the Pace 3 is kind of basic at the moment, where you basically just define a goal pace for your entire run, and then it prompts you if you're hitting your pace, below your pace, or above your pace. But it's basically just that one pace for your entire run. The Pace Pro feature, on the other hand, on the 165 is much more customizable, where you can define a pacing strategy. Like if you're going out for a 10K, you can set negative splits. So you could do the first couple miles at an easier pace and then increase pace as the run goes along, which is what a lot of us do, of course. And we can't talk about all that training without also talking about recovery. So on the recovery side of things, both of these will track your HRV or heart rate variability. And then both also do have a recovery time advisor, which gives you an estimation of how long it'll take for you to be fully recovered for a peak performance. So when it comes to recording outdoor activities, both of these have built-in GPS. So you can go record your outdoor activity without needing to bring your phone with you. But there's kind of a difference in terms of the satellite chipsets that these have. So both of these can access multiple satellite systems like GPS, Galileo, as well as some others. Where they differ though is that the Pace 3 has a dual band chipset, and what it's able to do is not only access different satellite systems, but also numerous satellite frequencies at one time. And with the goal of this kind of technology is to increase accuracy in situations where satellite signals can actually bounce off of objects like tall buildings, tall canyon walls, as well as heavy tree cover. Now, just because a watch does have this dual frequency chipset doesn't automatically make it more accurate than their single band counterparts. There's actually other factors involved, such as the antenna design, which play a factor in accuracy. So let's see how the Pace 3 compares with the 165 in this department. So starting out with the run here, so all good stuff out of the Pace 3 as well as the 165, where we have similar results from all the watches. Now, taking a look at the actual GPS tracks, both were laying down some pretty solid tracks for the most part, but I did notice that right here, the Pace 3 was a little bit off of the actual path that I was taking. And then on this road ride, again, very similar results in regards to the total distance out of all the devices, and the elevation gain was also pretty similar. And then on this ride here, again, great when it comes to the total distance, although the 165 did read a bit high when it comes to the elevation gain. Now, taking a look at the finer detail of the GPS tracks from those rides, pretty solid out of both devices from a high level, but if we take a look at some of these corners and curves up close, here's where we can see that the Pace 3 overshoots some of these corners that I took at higher speeds, and you also may notice just a little bit less detail with some of these S-bends. Now for some harder tests though, now let's take a look at a trail run, and we're looking at some pretty good stuff when it comes to the distance as well as the elevation gain. Now this run was kind of done in a pretty challenging trail for GPS, where there's a lot of heavy tree cover and some tall rock faces that kind of line the trail. And although there weren't any big misses from either of them, there were some spots during the run where the Pace 3 was a little bit off track at times and a bit too smooth in regards to the tracks. Now for one final example, let's now take it into the city with some tall buildings, and this is where things kind of get interesting. Okay, so starting along the pier here, so we've got the 165 a little bit off the path, like here, and a little bit down here. And then along the beach, both were doing a pretty good job, although a little bit off on the 165, like here and here on these two corners. But now let's go ahead and get into the streets where there's some tall buildings to contend with, and here's where the Pace 3 got a bit off track when I crossed the street right here. Now for the hardest part of this run though, at least in regards to GPS, was this section right here where I made some tight turns around a really tall building. So right here, the Pace 3 was a bit off crossing the street just like before, and then it cut in on this corner a bit right here. Right here though, then the 165 decided to take this corner a bit wide, but the Pace 3 decided to cut it a bit short. And then on this corner right here, the Pace 3 wasn't quite right, but 165 actually nailed it. So certainly not perfect out of either of them, but what you can see is that it's not like the Pace 3 is night and day better than the 165. In fact, I'd call these results kind of similar for the most part, so I think both of these can do a good job, but I don't necessarily think that the dual band chipset on the Pace 3 is a compelling reason to choose this watch. I'd consider some of the other differences when choosing between them. And when it comes to navigation, so both of these have breadcrumb style navigation, meaning that when you're doing your outdoor activity, it will give you a breadcrumb trail of your historical route. So you can, let's say, use this to backtrack your route. And then you can also load in routes with either of these for navigation, so this can help you guide you along during your activity. But neither of these have full-blown maps though, like their higher end counterparts like the COROS Apex and COROS Vertex, as well as Garmin's Forerunner 965 and Epic series. Okay, so when it comes to heart rate accuracy, the Pace 3 uses COROS' latest heart rate sensor, and the Forerunner 165 uses Garmin's 4th generation sensor. So it's not their latest 5th generation sensor that's found on some of their higher end watches, but a pretty decent sensor nonetheless. Now, I tested the crap out of both of these in this department, and I also wanted to note that I even switched wrists for many of these activities just to make sure that the results were consistent from one wrist to another. So let's go ahead and first start with some indoor cycling, which is the kind of activity I use to get a baseline just because it's generally an easy activity for wrist-based optical heart rate sensors to get right. And we're seeing some good results here out of both watches for the most part. A bit of a spike here from the Pace 3 on this ride, a bit of a spike here from the 165, and then a few drops on the Pace 3 right here. But all in all, pretty much good to go for these rides. Now, moving on to some intervals, at the beginning of this ride here, both watches took a minute or so to lock onto heart rate, which can happen with all heart rate sensors, but then after that, I saw some odd dropouts from the Pace 3 where it kind of lost the plot during a few points in the ride. And then moving on to some running, so on this treadmill run, it was pretty much spot on for nearly the entire run out of both watches, but the Pace 3 did have a bit of a hiccup right here at the end. And then on this run here, the 165 had a bit of an issue right here. But on this run here though, so both watches actually experienced a cadence lock. So this is an anomaly that can happen when an optical heart rate sensor accidentally interprets the rhythm of footsteps as heart rate. So it's kind of interesting to see that happen on both watches on that run. But I did have this one run here where the Pace 3 was a bit off the map. When it comes to cycling though, this is where I saw the biggest differences between these two, where it was kind of a night and day difference in terms of accuracy, where the Pace 3 consistently had issues with this kind of activity. So it may just kind of have a problem when it comes to the vibrations and bumps in the road while cycling, which can throw off wrist-based optical heart rate sensors. And then finally, when it comes to weight training, well, it was kind of a mixed bag from both watches where it was kind of hard to say if one was better than the other, where both had okay-ish days and then both had bad days as well. So with weight training, I just go ahead and suggest to use an external heart rate monitor if you want the most accurate data for that kind of activity. So when it comes to choosing between these two watches, it kind of comes down to a few different things: your display preference, battery life, smartwatch features, fitness features, and accuracy. The type of display is going to be totally up to you, so that's your preference, but that also does translate into battery life, so that's something to consider. Smartwatch features do go to the 165 though, with stuff like contactless payments, as well as more robust features with an Android device. And if you do want to go out on your run or your ride and listen to music without having to bring your phone with you, you can do that for cheaper with the Pace 3, but that will just be with MP3 files, and it doesn't have integration with music streaming services, which is what you can do with the slightly higher priced 165 music. However, on the sports side of things, the Pace 3 has more features like triathlon support, as well as more on the training feedback side of things like tracking your training load over time. However, on the flip side, the Forerunner probably wins on accuracy overall. Again, I think both these watches are solid options when it comes to a budget-friendly running and fitness watch, but there's some pretty clear differences between them which may make you want to choose one over the other. And I hope this video helped explain some of those differences. And if it did, do me a favor and just quickly hit that like button down below, and also subscribe to the channel for plenty more videos just like this that are coming soon. In the meantime, go have fun out there, and we will see you in the next video.